Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. I'm your host, Sandy Rosenthal. And today our guest is from the great state of North Carolina, and her name is Emily Donovan. Hey, Emily.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you.
It's great to see you. I've been so looking forward to having you on my show. I've been hearing for months about the work you've been doing. And I also understand you've had some big successes recently. So I really appreciate that you took the time to come on my show.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome. So, for our guests who aren't familiar with the great work that Emily's been doing, I'm just going to take just a minute to fill you in on what she's been up to. Emily Donovan is co-founder of Clean Cape Fear, a grassroots community group formed in 2017 after finding out that DuPont slash Chemours had contaminated North Carolina's drinking water supply for over 40 years with toxic PFAS, which is also called forever chemicals. Her work has helped elevate North Carolina's PFAS contamination crisis to the national stage. She's testified before Congress twice. She created a lobby day effort in Washington, D.C. for local community members and participated in a Washington Post live panel discussion with actor Mark Ruffalo and lawyer Rob Bilott. She helped organize and co-host two screenings of the movie Dark Waters featuring Mark Ruffalo, which resulted in North Carolina's Attorney General suing DuPont Chemours for natural resource damages and North Carolina's General Assembly filing a historic amount of PFAS bills during the 2021-2022 legislative session. This is all phenomenal. And recently, it doesn't end there. Recently, Emily has helped secure reverse osmosis filling stations for 49 public schools impacted by PFAS contamination in Brunswick and New Hanover counties. And she frequents DC and Raleigh, pressuring lawmakers and regulators for quicker responses to our growing PFAS public health crisis. And one last thing, there's a documentary that Ms. Donovan worked on with ABC News. It's now live and streaming on Hulu. It's called Trouble on Tap, a three-part documentary series that looks at how environmental pollution, climate change, and aging infrastructure are preventing communities across the U.S. from having access to free, drinkable water. It is an honor to be invited to testify, and you've been invited twice. So thank you so much for coming on my show. And I really look forward to hearing more about this access to free drinkable water. I mean, if water is free, what good is it if you can't drink it?
Exactly. And I think it's something that we've definitely, I know I took it for granted. And so I'm just happy to do a small part in this fight, honestly.
Well, we can't wait to hear more about it. I mean, I know you didn't wake up one day and get a documentary printed, produced, and sit in Washington D.C. So, how did you get from being Emily Donovan uh, to that your family and friends knew to being the Emily Donovan on my show today?
Definitely by accident and not something that I ever aspired um, or received any sort of formal training in. And really it happens. I think this is what's so common in people with these storylines is that it really happens when something that you care about is threatened. Whatever boils your blood or keeps you up at night. That is what motivates us. And for me, it quite honestly was waking up to local headlines in our newspaper back in 2017 telling us that there was this chemical in our drinking water. It was called Gen X, which was the replacement to the notorious PFOA, which was found in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And we knew about that chemical, loosely knew. It was like a C8 at the time. Rob Bilott discovered it. There was a documentary, The Devil We Know, had been released, and there was a huge settlement that the New York Times had just published and focused on Rob Bilott's story with the farmer in West Virginia. And so
Although, if I might
we were
interrupt for just a second, but Rob Bilott, the book is right behind me, wrote the book Exposure, and then his book was turned into a movie with Mark Ruffalo. So I just in case our listeners weren't brought up to snuff on that. So thank you. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. The journey that Mr. Balot has taken is just been a it's been an inspiring one, but also it's been one that I don't think America fully appreciates and understands the debt of gratitude we will all carry for the work that he's done and just shining a light on this. And I think that's what we know when we deal with big corporations, and we deal with the big guy. It's always the lack of transparency that is where the is where all of the things are playing out. It's in the darkness. And it's when the light is brought into the room, it's when the light is shined on the dark spots that we start seeing this is where the evil was happening. And in our particular situation, we were kind of like part two of the West Virginia story, unbeknownst to us. And so here we're thinking something is happening in West Virginia, and that's an unfortunate situation. Yay, they're getting progress. They're seeing all of this stuff play out. But in our situation, we didn't realize that nearly the same exact thing that was happening in Parkersburg, West Virginia, was playing out in our area in North Carolina with a similar factory that was owned by DuPont called Fayetteville Works in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Now, I live about 80 miles away from Fayetteville, and it's downstream of the Cape Fear River. And what we ended up learning through this local reporting was that DuPont had been dumping extreme amounts of PFAS waste into the Cape Fear River, which is our primary drinking water supply. There are 3 counties that sit below that facility, and they rely solely on the Cape Fear River as their primary source. It impact today, I think the impact is 500,000 residents rely on the Cape Fear River just below Chemours. And when I say Chemours, DuPont, again, which is the playbook that industry likes to do, is when they're met with massive liability, when that light is finally shone, or when the light is finally put in that dark spot and we learn what's going on, they're always a little step ahead. And in this case, what DuPont had done is they had spun off their chemistry. This we call PFAS, PFAS. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And for those that don't know, this chemistry is incredibly toxic. Everything that has been studied, scientists that have been studying it have found literally there's no organ system that's not impacted by this chemistry. And that chronic exposure can have serious health effects. And we were exposed, like you said earlier, for 40 years in large doses, and we still don't know the effects of what those exposures could potentially have on us in our community. So anyway, getting back to how I got involved is waking up, following the news stories, learning what was going on. I was involved locally in a lot of social justice issues, and so I was getting my feet wet and kind of learning how to navigate and speak out. And so when Chemours came to Wilmington, they were silent for 2 solid weeks when we first learned. And then they came to Wilmington and they only would meet, they wouldn't meet with the public. They would not host a town hall. They had a closed door meeting with local leaders. They only allowed 1 reporter in the room. And so we were livid and we started hosting protests. And it was after those protests that we realized there was so much anger and frustration in the community and lack of information that we decided to form Clean Cape Fear around a dinner table one night. And so after that protest, we gathered around Harper Peterson's dining room table, and Harper Peterson was a former mayor of Wilmington, and very concerned about the environment and the river. And so we decided, how can we map out to go after this? We knew this was a huge mountain. I mean, this was a company that knew what they were doing and were 1,000 steps ahead of us. So we formed Clean Cape Fear, and this was 7 of us. And so I focused mainly on communications because I had experience in that. And at that time, I was a youth director at a local church. And what was really hurting my heart was that I'm hosting these events every week, these youth group events, and we would end our time together with prayer requests and concerns. And literally half of the students in this program were offering up some very heavy prayers. Parent with terminal cancer, parent with recurrent cancer, young sibling who's stuck in the hospital with digestive and autoimmune issues, things that were just not normal. And so I felt this call and this need that my faith was leading me into this space, that it was now a time that I could not deny that I needed to move in this direction. And so I took those prayers and I've really kept them front and center in what motivates me. And I really do feel that I am on this journey to honor the call that Jesus has put me or on my heart, which is really to protect the environment, to protect our sacred resources like drinking water. I mean, these are things that we have totally just abdicated to industry when we are supposed to be the stewards of these resources. And so that's kind of what motivated me in the beginning. It's taken me on this journey. I can't say that it has been by my design. This has been totally by a design greater than me. And I've just been trying to be obedient and faithful to that path. And in that, I've met some amazing people. I've also dealt with issues. I know, just to get back a little bit of personally, when we first moved here, or 3 years after moving to this area, my husband developed a brain tumor. He was losing his vision. And so we have always wondered if that moment was also related to the drinking water. And here's the one thing that many of us in our community feel is like we don't have the answers right now. That is by design in our mind. Corporations don't want you to know the health effects. They don't want to be linked or held accountable through any sort of human health impacts and risks. But what we do know is that anything in our tap water that is not natural and supposed to be there is probably not helpful to us, especially if we are sick, especially if we are trying to heal from things. So whether these chemicals caused a certain illness, that doesn't matter to us. It matters to us, I take that back. It will always matter to us to know. But what matters to us more is that they don't belong there, and they're likely not helping us trying to heal if we are down and out or going through cancer treatments or having reoccurring illnesses.
You raised so many good points. I don't even know where to begin, but that was a fabulous story. I love the story about how you got involved and also how you continue to and I'm going to be asking you questions about that as well. On this final point that you just mentioned, you know, someone like Emily, or if you're trying to beat the big guys in your community, you don't have to know the answers. All you have to do is ask the questions, and then you take that information and then come to your conclusion. And your conclusion, Emily, is, hey, no matter what, these chemicals shouldn't be in my drinking water. Okay.
Exactly.
You may say they're not harmful, but that they shouldn't be there, period. And so why? Because too often, and I see this time and time again with my guests, too often the burden of proof is placed on the Emilys of the world. Why should Emily or me or you, the listener, prove that something is bad for you? You don't have to have the burden of proof. All you have to do is show that they're there, and they're there, right? The PFAS chemicals are there.
That is
Yes.
undeniable. And in fact,
Yes.
we started out learning about Gen X, and then we realized Gen X was just the tip of the iceberg. Eventually, there was a consent agreement put in place with Chemours. They were required by law to test the waste, the processed waste that they had been dumping into the river that was our drinking water supply. And we found that there were over 300 different PFAS, and the majority of them do not have health information. We don't know the mixture, the health impacts of the mixture that we drank, this toxic cocktail constantly for decades, every day. We don't know any of that information. We just have limited data on a handful of chemicals. And one thing that I always said in the beginning, and this is what we held firm on, and I think this is what's really important to the foundation of what makes Clean Cape Beer so successful, is our stance was a lack of information does not equal safe. And we just kept hammering that over and over again.
Say that
When
again. A
regulators
lack of information does not
equal safe.
faith.
A lack of safe.
Safe
Information does not mean this
equals
is safe to
safe.
drink. Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Of course not.
We and this is the arena that industry likes to play in. They like to the lack of information
Mm-hmm.
is where they have the highest strength. And
Mm-hmm.
so what we focus on is breaking through that lack of information. It's showing transparency, and it's also promoting the precautionary principle. So from the very beginning, I mean, literally the lack of information does not equal safe is just another term for precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is if you don't have information on the chemical, if you don't know if it's going to harm you, then exercise extreme precaution and avoid contact with it. And so this is a principle that the United States doesn't necessarily adhere to. They do adhere to it in the European Union. In the United States, it's more of a risk management situation that we learned. And I think that that does us a disservice. We always need to operate on the burden of proof should fall on the chemical
Right.
manufacturer, not on the consumer.
That's what they do. That's how they get away with it. They try to get away with it. They try to get away with it to place the burden on the people. Robert Ballard in his book went into that in great detail. And also he talked about, and you brought it up just now, Emily, about how for years the chemical industry just changed the makeup, the chemical composition of a chemical by like one neutron or something, and then oh, it's a different chemical now, and then just start the whole process all over again of getting permission to use it. It's criminal. They should go to prison. And we're working on it. So in the very, very beginning, Emily, you talked about how you got involved and you said it made my blood boil. It kept me awake at night. Anger and outrage is actually very good motivators. You, the listeners out there, I know this happened to me that when I was angry when the levees broke in New Orleans and I wanted the truth to be put in front of Congress and the American people. And I was mad. And my detractors, the people who were trying to prevent me from my work, would come to me and pretend to be my friend and would say, "Oh, anger is a terrible motivator. It's a terrible motivator." Well, no, it's not. It's, I think, really the best, or one of the best motivators out there. Just being mad about something. So don't feel like something's wrong with you for being mad. There's nothing wrong with you.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think it's important. It's an important point that you make. And I'm so grateful that you elevated that, is that a lot of times I'll get asked in the community, there's so many issues, climate change, drinking water, other social justice topics that are massively important to the fabric of our society. And they're like, which one do I pick? And I always say, well, which one, A, keeps you up at night and makes your blood boil? Because that is where your calling is. And so for me, that is how I kind of attune. I know I talked about my faith background, and that is how I find the next right step. The next right step is there are a lot of problems. I care greatly about many problems. I know that I am one person and I have a limited amount of energy and time. And so if I want to have the greatest impact, then I need to focus in on what is that one thing. And so for me, it was listening to that inner drum that was saying, you have to go after this. You are being called into this space. I think it's also important when we talk about anger because you can get really derailed with intense emotions. And one thing that I've learned is that anger needs to be productive.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting and stewing in anger and railing on the internet and not actually turning it into tangible actions or making sure that your anger turns into purposeful movement, that you can use it as fuel, you can use it as a motivator, but don't let it stall you out. You also need to put your foot on the gas and you need to start moving forward with that energy so that you make sure that you're using it in a productive capacity. And
Emily, that was
I will
beautiful.
say,
Yeah, you go ahead. I'll let you finish.
the one thing that we try to remind ourselves, because again, when you're going after the big guys, they have all the resources, they have all of the money, they have all the time, they have all the energy, but we have the people. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the one thing that we always must remind ourselves when we feel demotivated and we feel like we don't know if we're going down the right path or if we're ever going to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But when you have the power of the people, there is a limitless amount of things that you can get done. And so that's what I always remember, is that we know we are on the right track. We know that we are united as a community, and there's many things we can do when we have that type of unity.
Absolutely. And the big guys know it. The big guys know it. Nothing is more frightening and scary to the big guys than a small group They can be ragtag or they can be 100 people. That is the scariest thing to the big guys because they know what you just said. And I also thank you so much, Emily, because while Emily and I both agree that anger is a good fuel, okay, anger coming out your eyes and your face when you're trying to testify before Congress, or when you've got a cameraman's microphone in your face, anger does not come across well in that circumstance unless it's a very controlled anger. So yes, it is important not to sound angry when we speak about our causes, as difficult as it can be. And I can name two times in my 17 years where I did lose my cool, and both times it got noticed. But it's okay. We're human, but it's and I think it was okay. It worked out in the end. But yes, good advice, Emily, on that with the anger when you're talking to people. Emily, when you're feeling on your days, you must have them when you're feeling tired because everything's taking longer than you thought it would, or was a little bit harder than you thought it was going to be. What do you do when that happens to give yourself a boost internally?
Oh, well, rest is an important component because this, again, the one thing we told ourselves early on is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And when back, 6 years ago, when we first learned what Chemours had done in our area, the information that was coming at lightning speeds. It felt like we were drinking from a fire hydrant through a straw. It was just constant and nonstop. And so, you have to take care of yourself. You need to rest when you need to rest. You need to reconnect and savor. I love this whole idea, and I can't remember who brought it up. So forgive me for not being able to give proper attributions to this, but it's the concept of saving and savoring. But when we are fighting to protect resources, especially natural resources, it can get really overwhelming. And so learning how to savor the environment, go out and enjoy it to remind yourself why that you're doing this work. Or if you're fighting to protect your community and your family, then go be with them, spend time with them, carve out sacred moments where you can just savor life and rest and recover, and then you can move back into that space. And so this is what we do. And I also have an incredible support system. I mean, Clean Cape Fear's leadership team is phenomenal. And we all know how to take these times for ourselves, lift each other up, support each other, talk each other through hard moments. This isn't a journey you take alone. I know sometimes we see it. There's always that one person movement, but I'm a firm believer that behind every one person is a whole bunch of people that love and support that person. And so this is a team effort.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know. I'm pretty much an expert at this point. I don't know of any situations where one person was able to get anything accomplished. And those situations might have looked like it was one person, there was actually teams of people behind that one person. And that's one of the things that we need to accept right from the bat. No one can do anything alone. We need to do it with relationships. And I'm sure we could write a book. We could have 5 episodes on just that. But I did want to, Emily, you pointed out something which is really critically important about shining the light. It says when the big guys, excuse me, Landry, I'm starting all over with that one. When the light is shined on the big guys, when bad behavior is exposed, just the exposure, the damage that does to the public relations and goodwill of that company is infinitely it's infinitely damaging. And that's something the big guys guard with all their might, their goodwill, because once their goodwill is shattered, it could be years or never they could get their goodwill back. So shining the light, even if what they're doing was legal, shining the light on bad behavior is extremely beneficial to the motion and the mobility of your group and what you're trying to accomplish.
Exactly. And I think that's the one thing that we've noticed here with Chemours. So Chemours, it's interesting because if you've read Rod Ballott's book Exposure, when I read it, it literally felt like deja vu because the similar
Mm,
things were playing out
yeah.
for us obviously here in the Wilmington area. And just, you know what, I didn't say this in the beginning, but I do want to highlight that the scope of contamination in our region is massive. This is a facility that has impacted 8 counties and over 500,000 residents, 600 private wells and counting. They still have not found the outer boundaries and the extent of the contamination, not only from air releases, because this facility was allowed to pump this chemistry out into the air and contaminated the groundwater in a significant radius. And then they also contaminated the river. And the facility is so, the level of toxicity of this chemistry underneath the groundwater of the facility is what's currently seeping into the river. And so there is this legacy of exposure that we're still dealing with. And what we also don't talk about very regularly is that this river lets out directly into the Atlantic Ocean. And so for 40 years, this chemistry was getting pumped and dumped directly into a river that kept going on out into the Atlantic Ocean. And when we talk about transparency, this is where we're still learning how to have this conversation, because fate and transport studies have not caught up to what reasonable assumptions can be made. Like, hey, I'm curious, 40 years of dumping this chemistry into a river, what kind of impact does that have on our international waters? We don't know yet, because again, you have to have those fate and transport studies to try and figure it out. And so these are the conversations, these are the questions, like you said, when you keep asking questions, the big guys don't like it. And so that's what we are here to do. We are asking the questions. We are always focused on accountability and making sure that we get those answers and that the community is well informed, because Chemours has spent the last couple of years running commercials in our community, talking about how they are a good neighbor, and they're doing all of this greenwashing right now, that that their chemistry is essential to our clean energy future. But what they're not talking about is they're not talking about how responsible they are, that everything that they've had to do has been legally imposed on them, that they're not meeting their targets. There was a delay in some of their remediation. They've been issued numerous notices of violation, and they're currently asking to expand production of their chemistry, while other manufacturers are getting out of this chemistry because they're seeing the writing on the wall. Like 3M earlier this year, or late last year, said that they were no longer going to make PFAS. The European Union has decided that the cost of inaction is so massive, billions and billions of dollars every year in healthcare costs, and all of those economic drivers, the hidden economic costs, are so extensive that it's actually better to remove this chemistry from our life. And Chemours here is doubling down. And they're saying, we're just going to make more, which is similar to what they did with PFOA and the stewardship agreement. When you read exposures, you'll see that the EPA entered into a stewardship agreement to remove PFOA. 3M said, we're no longer going to make it. Chemours said, let us buy your recipe, and we'll make PFOA in Fayetteville for 10 years, and then we'll voluntarily phase it out and replace it with Gen X. So this is kind of like we're caught in a spin cycle with this corporation.
It's making my blood boil, just like you were talking about earlier. But if I want to give some hope to our listeners, though, because even though, as Emily pointed out, the big guys are one step ahead, and yes, they're all playing out of the same playbook. Whether it's Big Chem, DuPont, or Big Ag, Big Hog, they're all playing out of the same playbook. However, where you can find hope is they are banking on there not being like Emily around. Okay, they're banking on that, and when they bank on that, and when they make plans, assuming there'll be no Emilys or no Sandys, they end up making mistakes, and when they make those mistakes and get caught, as I mentioned earlier, the damage is devastating. That they think they're so big and so have so much money that they're invincible. They're not. They're not. And get them you will. It's just going to take a little bit longer than you thought it would. But you do it with friends, and you do it with the help of listening to these episodes. on Beat the Big Guys. I don't know if I mentioned, but I did interview Robert Ballot on the Beat the Big Guys. That's episode 15. So if after listening to this episode, you might consider listening to 15, because that'll fill in some of the blanks that we just touched upon only very, very briefly. Emily, I'm afraid we're about run out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners to help them beat the big guys in their communities?
Yeah, real quick, I want to point out that another thing that helps sustain Clean Cape Fear through our fight is that there is a national coalition of community groups just like mine that are all fighting PFAS chemicals in their own communities. And the coalition is the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. And joining and being a part of this coalition, I'm on the leadership team now, has provided me with some tremendous resources and strengths. And so for any listener out there that is finding out for the first time maybe that their water's contaminated with PFAS, or their region is dealing with a polluter that has this chemistry, know that we're out there, and that you can reach out and try and join our coalition, and we can provide you with resources and support.
Emily Donovan is out there with that coalition. So thank you so much. This has been terribly uplifting and enlightening, and I learned a lot. I did know a lot about PFAS. I learned even more today, and I hope our listeners did too. And speaking of listeners, thank you out there for being with us today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. A video version of it is going to be available on my playlist, Beat the Big Guys at Sandy Rosenthal on YouTube. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and rate this podcast on all your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys. Okay, stay with me, Emily.